Inside a cave near Jerusalem called Sorek, mineral layers were building up drop by drop, decade by decade, quietly recording a change in the region's rainfall that no single person alive at the time could have felt from one harvest to the next. At almost the same centuries, in harbour towns from the Nile Delta to the coast of Greece, ships were sailing further than any generation before them had dared, carrying tin mined thousands of miles away to smiths who needed it to make bronze, and carrying grain, ivory and gold between kings who addressed each other as brothers in letters written on clay. Neither process announced itself as a threat. A cave does not warn a kingdom. A trade route does not warn its own users that it has no backup. But by the time both had run their course, within roughly 50 years, nearly every great palace between the Aegean and the Nile lay burned, abandoned, or reduced to a shadow of what it had been. This is the story of a world that grew wealthy by depending on everyone else, and unravelled for the very same reason when several long, slow, separate catastrophes arrived, unannounced, in the same 2 or 3 generations. Ugarit sat on the Mediterranean coast of what is now Syria, a wealthy trading port with its own king, its own script, and warehouses that moved goods between Egypt, Cyprus, and the Hittite heartland to the north. Its ruins, excavated at a site called Ras Shamra since French archaeologists began digging there in 1929, gave up thousands of clay tablets, government letters, contracts, and the private notes of merchants that let historians reconstruct its final years almost month by month, which is rare for any Bronze Age city and rarer still for one caught in the exact moment of collapse. In its last recorded exchanges, the king of Ugarit, a man named Amurapi, wrote to the king of a nearby island the text called Al-Ashia, usually identified with Cyprus, that his own fleet and much of his army had already been sent away to help defend the Hittite Empire, his overlord, leaving his own coastline undefended. Enemy ships, the letters say, had already been sighted burning towns nearby. Amurapi asked for whatever aid could be sent. None of the surviving correspondence shows an answer arriving in time. Another tablet, addressed to the king of Al-Ashia from an official at Ugarit, describes 7 enemy ships appearing off the coast, and doing considerable damage before withdrawing, a small number that mattered, because Ugarit had almost no warships left to meet them. A separate letter, from a palace official named Rapanu managing the king's affairs while messages went unanswered, worries openly about grain shipments that have not arrived, and about towns further up the coast that have already gone silent. The tone throughout is not panic so much as a bureaucrat's frustration. The machinery for calling in help still existed. Treaties, allied fleets, a chain of command running up to the Hittite king. But the machinery had no time left to work. Archaeologists found the city's destruction layer, a stratum of ash, collapsed mud brick, and scattered bronze weapons, dating to around 1190 to 1185 BC, thick enough that Ugarit was never significantly reoccupied afterward. Arrowheads were found embedded in walls, and storerooms of large ceramic pithoi, the tall storage jars used for oil and grain, were found still standing where they had been abandoned, some never emptied. Among the debris was an unfired tablet, still bearing the impressions of a stylus, apparently abandoned mid-task when whatever happened, the clay never given the chance to harden into something meant to last. Ugarit's world did not exist in isolation, and that is the point worth sitting with before going further. This one city's archive names Egypt, Hatti, Cyprus and unnamed raiders arriving by sea all in a handful of years, because Ugarit's economy and its defence both depended on relationships running in every direction across the eastern Mediterranean. Its grain came partly from Egypt in bad years. Its bronze depended on tin arriving from far to the east, ferried along a chain of ports. Ugarit itself did not control at either end. Its soldiers and ships, at the moment they were needed most, were serving someone else's war on someone else's frontier. What destroyed Ugarit was not one army with one grievance. It was a city that had, over generations, wired itself into a much larger system, so that when that system came under stress from several directions at once, Ugarit had nowhere left to stand on its own. The rest of this story is that larger system, how it was built, why it worked so well for so long, and what happened when several of its load-bearing supports gave way within the same 1 or 2 generations, leaving cities like Ugarit exposed exactly when they could least afford it. By the 14th century BC, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East had settled into something historians now call the Club of Great Powers, a small circle of kingdoms: Egypt, the Hittite Empire in central Anatolia, Babylon in Mesopotamia, Assyria to its north, and the kingdom of Mitanni in what is now northern Syria, who treated each other as diplomatic equals and addressed one another in letters as brother, regardless of how large or how far apart their kingdoms actually were. A cache of roughly 380 clay tablets found at Amarna in Egypt, the short-lived capital built by the pharaoh Akhenaten, preserves this correspondence in remarkable detail. Requests for gold, complaints about the quality of gifts sent, arrangements for royal marriages meant to bind two courts together, and the occasional blunt threat when a vassal ruler seemed to be drifting toward a rival's camp. In one exchange, a Babylonian king complains that the gold Egypt sent him looked thin and pale next to what he expected, and asks pointedly whether it had been melted down and cut with something cheaper before it left the Egyptian treasury. A small, almost comic detail that nonetheless shows how closely these kings tracked the material worth of what passed between them. Gold moved from Egypt, which controlled Nubian mines, to courts that had none. Tin and finished bronze goods moved along different routes entirely. Horses, chariots, ivory, purple-dyed cloth, and skilled craftsmen were all objects of this exchange, given as gifts between kings in quantities meant to signal status as much as to fill a treasury, and royal daughters were sent from Mitanni and Babylon to marry into the Egyptian court as a form of alliance building that outlasted any single treaty. Beneath the great powers sat a wide band of smaller kingdoms and city-states, vassals bound by treaty to one great power or another, expected to pay tribute, supply troops when called on, and stay out of quarrels between their overlords, in exchange for military protection and a share in the trade networks that protection made possible. Ugarit was exactly this kind of vassal, bound to the Hittites. So were dozens of towns along the Levantine coast and inland Syria, each ruled by a local king who wrote frequently and often anxiously to his Egyptian or Hittite patron, asking for grain, for soldiers, for arbitration in a border dispute with a neighbouring vassal. This system was not peaceful in any simple sense. The great powers fought real wars, most famously a Hittite-Egyptian confrontation at Kadesh in the 13th century BC that ended, unusually for the period, in one of history's earliest surviving written peace treaties inscribed on a silver tablet, whose text survives today only in later stone and clay copies kept at both Hattusa and at Karnak in Egypt. That treaty went further than simply ending hostilities. It bound each king to extradite political refugees back to the other, and to send troops if either kingdom faced rebellion or outside attack, an early form of mutual defence pact between former enemies who had realised neither could afford to keep fighting the other while other pressures mounted elsewhere. This is the structure worth holding on to for the rest of the story, not scattered, self-sufficient kingdoms who might rise or fall independently, but a single interlocking system, moving metal, grain, and legitimacy across enormous distances, in which every participant's prosperity was quietly conditional on everyone else's stability. A king who needed tin could not simply seize a tin mine on the other side of the known world. He needed working relationships with the rulers of every territory the tin had to cross. A famine in one kingdom could be eased by grain shipped from another, but only if the sea lanes were safe and the diplomatic relationship was intact. A system built this way is resilient against a shock. In any one place, another partner can often absorb the loss, but it is not resilient against shocks that hit several places at the same time, because there is no longer a healthy partner left to absorb anything. That vulnerability sat at the centre of the late Bronze Age world for as long as it worked, invisible because nothing yet had tested it in enough places at once. Bronze is an alloy, typically about 90% copper and 10% tin, and that simple ratio hides an enormous logistical problem, because copper deposits were reasonably widespread across the eastern Mediterranean, with Cyprus alone supplying so much of it that the island's name is the root of the very word copper, while workable tin sources were scarce and often extremely far away. The best documented ancient tin sources lay in places like Afghanistan in Central Asia, and possibly in parts of Western Europe including Britain and Iberia, meaning that a bronze sword forged in Greece or a bronze plough tip used in the Nile Delta might contain metal that had passed through the hands of merchants in a dozen intermediate ports before it ever reached a smith's furnace. Recent isotope studies on tin recovered from Bronze Age sites in Israel and Turkey have traced some of that metal's chemical fingerprint back toward tin deposits in Central Asia, in the mountains of what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, a route that, if correct, would mean tin used in a Levantine workshop had already crossed close to 2,000 miles of mountain and desert before it ever touched salt water. a shipwreck discovered off the southern coast of Turkey near a place called Uluburun, dated to roughly the late 14th century BC, gives a vivid physical snapshot of this trade in a single lost cargo. About 10 tons of copper ingots and 1 ton of tin ingots, shaped in a standardized oxhide form for easy handling, alongside glass ingots, ebony logs, ostrich eggshells, elephant and hippopotamus ivory, Baltic amber, and pottery from at least 7 or 8 different regions, all apparently gathered for one voyage, moving along the coasts of Cyprus, the Levant and the Aegean. A second, smaller wreck found off Cape Gelidonia on the same Turkish coast dating slightly later, carried a cargo of scrap bronze and ingots that some archaeologists read as evidence of a travelling smith rather than a palace-organised merchant fleet, a reminder that this trade ran on more than one scale at once, from vast royal shipments down to individual craftsmen carrying their own stock along the coast. A single ship like the one at Uluburun represented an almost absurd concentration of value and distance, threads from Scandinavia to sub-Saharan Africa knotted together in one hull, carrying enough copper and tin between them to arm hundreds of soldiers, or equip an entire village of farmers with tools. This is what made the Bronze Age economy powerful and fragile in the same motion. Powerful because it connected craftsmen and rulers across an enormous area in a shared technology and a shared standard of value. Oxhide ingots of roughly consistent weight functioned almost like an early currency across multiple kingdoms, exchanged and remelted from Sardinia to the Levant. Fragile because no single kingdom that depended on bronze weapons, bronze tools and bronze ploughshares could produce that bronze entirely on its own. Every one of them needed tin to keep arriving from very far away, carried by ships and caravans that had to pass through multiple other kingdoms' waters and territories to get there. If piracy increased along one stretch of coast, if a palace that normally coordinated a caravan route collapsed, if the political relationships that kept overland routes safe broke down even in a region that itself produced no tin at all, the effect could ripple outward to a bronze workshop thousands of miles away that had never heard of the original disruption. Archaeologists have found evidence that some late Bronze Age workshops kept only small working stocks of tin on hand, suggesting a system that ran close to its margins rather than one with deep reserves built in. A modern comparison some historians reach for is a just-in-time supply chain, efficient exactly because it does not waste resources stockpiling far more than it needs, and vulnerable exactly because a break anywhere along a long chain of dependencies can starve everyone downstream of it. Tin is the physical thread running under nearly everything the rest of this story touches. Every army's weapons, every farmer's tools, and every palace's status depended on that thread staying unbroken across thousands of miles of sea and mountain road, for centuries, without anyone in charge of the whole route. On the western coast of the Peloponnese in Greece stood a palace the ancient sources associate with the legendary king Nestor, its ruins now called Pylos, one of several Mycenaean centres that dominated mainland Greece and Crete in the late Bronze Age. Unlike the loose, poetic image many people carry of heroic Bronze Age Greece from later epic poetry, the archaeological reality at Pylos was a tightly run bureaucratic state, run from a central palace complex that controlled a surrounding territory of farms, workshops, and dependent towns through an administrative system almost obsessively focused on record-keeping. Scribes at Pylos wrote in a script called Linear B, adapted from an earlier Cretan script, and used to write an early form of Greek, on unbaked clay tablets meant only as temporary working records, most of which survive today purely by accident, baked hard not by careful preservation but by the fires that destroyed the palace itself. The script itself sat unread for centuries after its rediscovery, until a British architect and amateur linguist named Michael Ventris deciphered it in 1952, proving, against the assumption of most specialists at the time, that the language underneath the strange signs was an early form of Greek, rather than some unrelated Minoan tongue. Those tablets record an extraordinary level of central control, quantities of bronze allocated to specific smiths for specific quotas of weapons or tools, rations of wheat and figs issued to hundreds of named workers, including groups of women and children employed spinning and weaving wool on an industrial scale, with some tablets tracking flocks, running into the thousands of sheep across the kingdom's territory, purely for their wool, lists of chariot wheels in storage, and rosters of rowers assigned to watch posts along the coast in what appear to be the palace's final, anxious months. Officials with titles like the Lauagetas, a war leader ranking just below the king, and local district governors called kasiriwi, a title that would later evolve into the Greek word for a king itself, appear throughout these records, evidence of a layered administrative hierarchy reaching down into every village under the palace's control. This was a redistributive economy. Farmers and herders across the palace's territory paid a share of their produce and labour upward to the centre, and the palace in turn redistributed food, raw materials, and finished goods back out, funded workshops, maintained roads and fortifications, and organised the long-distance trade that brought in tin, ivory, and other goods the region could not produce itself. The system worked, and worked well, for centuries, but it concentrated an enormous amount of specialised knowledge and coordinating power in a single administrative centre. Only the palace scribes could read and write Linear B. There is no clear evidence the script was used for anything beyond palace administration. No private letters, no literature, meaning the ability to keep the system's own records depended entirely on the survival of a small trained class working inside the palace walls. Only the palace could organise the large-scale bronze production its territory's farmers and soldiers relied on, because only the palace controlled the tin imports and the smiths' rations that kept the workshops running. This concentration made Mycenaean Greece remarkably productive when the palace stood, and remarkably exposed the moment it did not. Destroy the palace, and you did not just destroy a building, you destroyed the only functioning administrative memory of the whole regional economy, the only body capable of organising large defensive forces, and the only institution importing the tin that let local smiths keep making bronze at all. Those Pylos tablets recording rowers posted to watch the coast were written, historians believe, in the palace's very last season before it burned, a bureaucracy still trying to do its job, counting and allocating, right up to the point where there was no one left it was counting for. North of Ugarit, across the Taurus Mountains in central Anatolia, the Hittite Empire had built one of the late Bronze Age's largest territorial states from its capital at Hattusa, a fortified city of temples, archives and massive stone gateways carved with lion and sphinx guardians, ruling directly over the Anatolian plateau and indirectly through vassal treaties over a wide arc of territory stretching south into Syria. The empire's core territory, however, sat on a high, dry plateau poorly suited to reliably feeding a capital city, and the army the empire needed to hold its sprawling vassal network together, and Hittite kings appear to have depended, in difficult years, on grain shipped in from outside, including from Egypt. A letter associated with a Hittite queen, likely Puduhipa, wife of the king Hattusili III, requests emergency grain from the Egyptian pharaoh in terms suggesting real urgency rather than routine trade, and other texts describe grain shipments being sent from vassal territories in Syria toward the Anatolian heartland, evidence some historians read as a chronic, worsening food problem in the empire's final decades rather than a single bad harvest. The empire was also politically brittle in ways that had nothing to do with weather. Hittite succession was repeatedly contested. The throne changed hands through assassination, coups, and rival claimants backed by different factions of the nobility more than once across the 13th century BC, and Hattusili III had himself taken the throne from his own nephew, a young king named Uhi-Teshub, a generation before the empire's final crisis, a precedent that left the ruling family's legitimacy an ongoing unsettled question that later kings like Tudhaliya-Foi still had to manage through careful propaganda and public ritual. To the north, the Hittites fought a long, grinding, never fully resolved conflict against a loose confederation of mountain peoples called the Kaska, who raided the empire's northern territories for generations and never allowed the Hittite kings to fully secure that frontier, tying down troops and resources the empire could ill afford to lose elsewhere. At the empire's western edge, in territory near the Aegean coast, Hittite texts describe recurring trouble with a region called Wilusa, generally identified by most historians with the site known from later Greek legend as Troy, and with a shadowy power the Hittites called Ahiyawa, a name many scholars connect to the Mycenaean Greeks, or to some Mycenaean-influenced kingdom, operating along the Anatolian coastline and stirring up local vassals against Hittite authority. A document historians call the Milawata letter, written near the very end of the empire, shows a Hittite king still trying to manage a rebellious western vassal and its connections to Ahiyawa, evidence the western frontier problem had never actually gone away. It had simply continued simmering for generations. None of this alone would have destroyed the empire. Overstretched, food-dependent, and internally quarrelsome empires had survived for generations before, and would again. But it meant the Hittite state was managing multiple chronic weaknesses simultaneously, a grain supply it could not fully control, a legitimacy question that never fully resolved, a restless northern frontier against the Casca, and a restless western frontier around Wilusa, at exactly the moment external shocks arrived that a healthier state might have absorbed. When Ugarit, his king, wrote asking for the ships and soldiers, he had already sent north to help defend his Hittite overlord. He was sending them into an empire that had less capacity to spare than it once had, an empire already quietly juggling several problems that had nothing to do with the raiders now appearing along the Levantine coast. The empire that had once dictated terms to Egypt at Kadesh was, by its final years, an empire whose own capital would eventually be found abandoned rather than burned in battle, a difference that would turn out to matter for how historians read what actually happened to it. Egypt, unlike Hatti or the Mycenaean palaces, would survive the crisis of the following decades, but not untouched, and its own records provide some of the clearest surviving evidence of the pressure the entire region came under. Under the pharaoh Ramesses III, who reigned in the early 12th century BC, Egyptian inscriptions describe defending the kingdom against a coalition of foreign attackers the text grouped together as peoples of the sea. In at least two major campaigns, one in the pharaoh's 5th regnal year against Libyan groups pressing on Egypt's western frontier, and a larger, more famous one in his 8th regnal year, recorded in extensive relief carvings and hieroglyphic text on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu near Thebes. The Year 8 inscriptions describe a coordinated invasion by land and sea, naming several distinct peoples, among them groups the Egyptians called the Palace, generally connected by historians to the Philistines who would later settle the Canaanite coast, along with groups called the Cheker, the Shurdan, the Denyen and the Weshesh, moving together with their families, carts and cattle, suggesting migration as much as raiding. The Medinet Habu reliefs show Egyptian forces meeting the seaborne attackers in a naval battle within the mouths of the Nile itself, archers on the riverbanks and aboard Egyptian ships raining arrows into the invaders' vessels, while Egyptian marines used grappling hooks to capsize enemy boats, a battle Ramesses II's inscriptions claim as a decisive victory, and the accompanying text has the pharaoh boasting that he turned the river mouths into a wall of dead bodies. A piece of triumphal exaggeration typical of Egyptian royal propaganda, but also a hint at just how large and threatening the invading force must have seemed to the Egyptian court at the time. Egyptian royal inscriptions are propaganda documents composed to glorify the king, and historians treat their claims of total victory with real caution. But the broader outcome does appear genuine. Egypt was not overrun, its major cities were not destroyed the way Ugarit or the Mycenaean palaces were, and Ramesses III went on ruling for roughly another 2 decades after the Year 8 campaign. A vast administrative document known as the Great Harris Papyrus, compiled near the end of his reign, records enormous royal donations of land, cattle and goods to Egyptian temples, suggesting that even amid these wars the state could still marshal significant resources, though some historians read the scale of these donations as part of what eventually weakened the crown's own treasury, relative to the growing wealth of the temple establishments. The victory nonetheless came at a cost that later documents hint at plainly. Records from the Egyptian workers' village at Deir el-Medina, the community of craftsmen who built royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, describe the first known organized labor strike in recorded history occurring in the 29th year of Ramesses II's reign, workers walking off the job and marching to a nearby mortuary temple because grain rations, their wages, had not been delivered on time, a sign of strain reaching into the state's ability to pay even its most essential specialist workers, the very men trusted with the secret tombs of Egypt's kings. Egypt also appears to have lost most of its direct control over Canaan and the Levantine coast in the decades following these wars, territory it had held as an empire for centuries, even while its Nile heartland held. Egypt's experience is the clearest evidence in the whole story that this was not simply a matter of strong states surviving and weak ones falling. Egypt was arguably the strongest single power in the region, and it still had to fight for its survival, on 2 separate fronts within the space of a few years, still lost territory it had ruled for generations, and still saw the strain reach as far as the men building its kings' tombs. What varied from kingdom to kingdom was not whether the pressure arrived, but how much slack each state had left to absorb it, and Egypt, precisely because it had the Nile's reliable flooding underneath everything else, simply had more slack than most. The phrase Sea Peoples is not an ancient one. It was coined in the 19th century by the French Egyptologist Emmanuel de Rouge to describe the various named groups Egyptian inscriptions list as attacking by land and sea, and no single ancient text treats them as one unified nation with one homeland or one leader. This distinction matters because it shapes how carefully historians now have to speak about who these people actually were. The Egyptian texts name several distinct groups, the Peleset, Cheka, Sherden, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh, and Lukka among them, and some of these names appear in Egyptian records even earlier, in the 14th century BC, fighting as mercenaries in Egyptian and other armies rather than as invaders. Sherden warriors, easily recognized in Egyptian art by their distinctive horned helmets and round shields, are shown serving as personal bodyguards to Rameses II himself at the Battle of Kadesh, generations before other Sherden groups appear among the raiders attacking Egypt, and the Lukka, a people associated with the rugged coast of southwestern Anatolia, appear even earlier, still in the Amarna letters, already notorious as raiders and pirates, troubling shipping along the same coasts they would later be accused of attacking directly. All of this suggests these were not a single migrating horde that appeared out of nowhere, but a shifting set of populations, some already well known around the eastern Mediterranean as soldiers for hire, who came together in new, larger and more destructive coalitions as the wider crisis deepened. Proposed homelands for various groups include Sardinia, Sicily, Western Anatolia and the Aegean world, though the evidence for each connection is debated and in several cases rests more on similarity of names to later place names than on secure archaeological proof. The most useful way to understand the Sea Peoples, most specialists now argue, is less as an invading army with a single cause, and more as a symptom of the same instability affecting everyone else in the story: displaced populations, disbanded mercenary bands, refugees from famine or conflict in their own home regions, and opportunistic raiders, moving in overlapping waves across a system that was already destabilizing from other pressures and finding weakened, undefended coastal targets as they went. The Medinet Habu reliefs support this reading in an important physical detail. Some of the attacking groups are shown, accompanied by ox carts loaded with women, children, and household goods, not the profile of a purely military raiding force, but of people relocating, whether by choice or by necessity, in large numbers, alongside their distinctive feathered headdresses that Egyptian artists took great care to render accurately, evidence that Egyptian scribes were recording what they actually observed rather than a stock image of a generic enemy. Where these movements originated is still argued over. Some historians point toward the collapse of Mycenaean Palace authority itself as a source of displaced populations looking for new territory, creating a genuinely circular problem in which the collapse in one region fed the disruption of another. What can be said with more confidence is where these movements landed, and what they left behind. A name, Peleset, that most historians connect directly to the later Philistines, who would establish a cluster of city-states, including Ashkelon and Ekron, along the Canaanite coast within the same general period, adopting some Aegean-style pottery traditions, including a locally made version of Mycenaean-style painted ware, and settlement patterns even as they assimilated into the region's existing Semitic-speaking populations over the following generations. The Sea Peoples, in other words, were not simply an outside force that broke a stable world. They were themselves partly a product of that world's breaking, refugees and opportunists both, riding a crisis they did not single-handedly cause and, by their raids, deepening it for everyone still standing. For decades, historians debated the Late Bronze Age collapse largely through texts and destruction layers, arguments about armies, treaties and burned buildings. But over the past generation, scientists working outside archaeology entirely have added a different kind of evidence, drawn from pollen grains, cave deposits and lake sediments, and it points toward a sustained climate shift across the eastern Mediterranean. In roughly the same window the political collapse occurred. A stalagmite formation inside Soret Cave near Jerusalem, built up mineral layer by mineral layer over thousands of years the way tree rings build up annually, preserves a chemical record of rainfall reaching back through the entire Bronze Age, and researchers reading that record, including work led by the geochemist Miriam Bar Matthews, identified a pronounced dry period beginning around 1200 BC and continuing for roughly 150 years, among the driest stretches in the entire multi-thousand-year record the cave preserves. Separately, pollen cores drawn from lake and marine sediment in Cyprus, the Sea of Galilee and the Nile Delta, studied by researchers including David Kaniewski and Daphne Langut, show a marked decline in the pollen of cultivated crops, especially olive and cereal pollen, and an increase in the pollen of drought-tolerant scrub vegetation, beginning in the same general period, consistent with agricultural land across multiple widely separated regions failing or being abandoned around the same decades. This broader climate event is sometimes referred to by researchers as the 3.2 kiloyear event, named for its approximate age of 3,200 years before the present, and some scientists connect it to changes in ocean circulation patterns and shifting rainfall belts that affected a wide swath of the Mediterranean and Near East simultaneously rather than any single region in isolation. Even the Nile's own flood records, reconstructed indirectly through sediment and later administrative texts, hint at a run of weaker than average floods across roughly the same period, which would have squeezed Egyptian grain surpluses precisely when neighbouring kingdoms were leaning on Egypt hardest for emergency shipments. Historians treat this evidence with appropriate care. Climate data can establish that drought conditions existed across a wide area in the right time window, but it cannot by itself prove that drought caused any specific city's destruction, and correlation across a broad region is not the same as a direct causal chain in every individual case, and some researchers still argue the exact severity and duration of the dry period has been overstated in popular accounts of the collapse. Even with that caution, the drought evidence changes how the collapse has to be understood, because it offers a mechanism for why so many different unconnected causes, palace overreach, contested successions, roaming displaced peoples, might all have been landing on multiple societies during the exact same decades rather than by pure coincidence. A multi-generational drought does not need to burn a single building to be devastating. It lowers crop yields year after year, shrinks the grain surplus a palace economy depends on to pay its soldiers, scribes, and craftsmen, and pushes populations that can no longer feed themselves at home to look for food, land, or plunder elsewhere, which in turn helps explain both the Hittite Empire's documented grain crisis and the appearance of displaced groups moving with carts and families along the same coasts under pressure from other kingdoms' collapsing food supplies. The sky in this reading did not act alone, but it may have been the pressure quietly tightening underneath nearly every other crisis this story has already described, an invisible strain running for a century and a half beneath letters about ships, grain, and enemies at the gate. Alongside burned timbers and arrowheads, excavators working at several late Bronze Age sites destroyed during this period found a different kind of evidence entirely, walls that had fallen inward or outward in patterns inconsistent with deliberate demolition or fire alone, column drums toppled and lying in a single direction, and in a small number of cases, human skeletons found crushed beneath collapsed masonry, in positions suggesting sudden structural failure rather than combat. At the site of Mycenae itself, near its famous Lion Gate, and at other Mycenaean centres including Tiryns, whose massive fortification walls were once thought so enormous that later Greeks attributed them to mythical one-eyed giants called cyclopes, sections of wall were found displaced from their foundations in ways some archaeologists argue point to seismic activity rather than siege engines, which late Bronze Age armies in this region are not well attested as possessing in any case. Excavations at the Cypriot city of Enkomi and at Ras Shamra itself found similar patterns, buildings with walls fallen in directions that make more sense as ground shaking than as an attacking force pushing them over. And in at least one deposit, a group of skeletons was found positioned as though caught suddenly indoors rather than fleeing a fire or fighting an enemy. The American archaeologist Robert Drews and later researchers proposed what has become known as the earthquake storm hypothesis, the idea that the eastern Mediterranean, which sits across several active tectonic fault systems where the African, Anatolian and Aegean plates grind against one another, experienced an unusually intense cluster of major earthquakes concentrated within a relatively short window around 1225 to 1175 BC, striking sites from Mycenaean Greece through Cyprus and into the Levant. This hypothesis remains genuinely debated among specialists rather than settled fact, distinguishing earthquake damage from deliberate destruction, in a ruin 3,000 years old is difficult, some sites show clear evidence of both fire and structural collapse together, which could mean an earthquake followed by looting, or could mean an earthquake striking a building already on fire, or could mean two entirely separate events, years apart being read together, simply because they occur in the same excavated layer. What makes the earthquake evidence significant for understanding the wider collapse is not that it definitively explains any one city's fall, but that it adds another layer to the same underlying pattern the drought evidence and the political evidence both suggest. Multiple independent kinds of catastrophe, arriving in overlapping decades across a very wide geographic area, none of them alone sufficient to explain the total picture, but together representing a level of simultaneous stress the Late Bronze Age system had never previously had to absorb all at once. A single earthquake striking a single healthy, well-supplied city is a disaster its people can often recover from, rebuilding within a generation, as Mediterranean societies had done many times before and would do many times again. And there is good evidence that some Bronze Age cities did exactly this after earlier, isolated earthquakes decades or centuries earlier. A major earthquake striking a city whose grain reserves were already thin from years of drought, whose garrison had already been sent elsewhere to help a struggling ally, and whose trade routes for replacement tin and timber were already disrupted by raiders elsewhere along the coast, is a very different kind of event, one with far less capacity left in the surrounding system to help it recover. The ground itself, in other words, may not have needed to act as the single cause of the collapse to matter enormously. It needed only to strike a system that had already spent down most of its resilience on everything else. For most of the 20th century, historians looking at the Late Bronze Age collapse tended to search for a single dominant explanation: the sea peoples as an unstoppable invading horde, or drought alone, or internal revolt by peasants and lower classes against oppressive palace economies, or the spread of ironworking, undercutting the value of the bronze trade that held the old system together. Each of these theories explains some of the surviving evidence well, and fails badly to explain the rest. Invasion alone cannot easily account for sites like the Hittite capital Hattusa, which shows signs of abandonment and looting after the fact rather than a clear pattern of violent destruction by an outside army, nor for the timing of a Gip's Nile Delta labour strike, which had nothing to do with any invading force. Drought alone struggles to explain why some drought-affected regions, including parts of Egypt, survived largely intact while others did not. Internal revolt is supported by a few suggestive later Egyptian and Levantine texts describing lower-class unrest, but there is little direct archaeological evidence of it at most of the major destroyed sites. Ironworking spread, meanwhile, appears to accelerate mainly after the collapse rather than clearly causing it, more a consequence of bronze's tin supply becoming unreliable than a competing technology that made bronze obsolete beforehand, since early iron tools were often no better and sometimes worse than well-made bronze ones, and only became widespread once smiths across the region had spent generations improving the much higher temperatures and different techniques iron smelting demands. What has largely replaced the search for one cause, in more recent scholarship, most associated with the historian Eric Klein, is a systems collapse model borrowed partly from how modern researchers think about the failure of complex, tightly linked networks, whether financial systems, power grids, or ecosystems, and it echoes ideas the anthropologist Joseph Tainter had earlier applied to the collapse of complex societies more broadly, where societies invest so heavily in the administrative complexity that makes them productive that the marginal cost of maintaining that complexity eventually outweighs what it delivers, leaving the system unable to respond when several problems land together. In this model, complexity and interconnection are not incidental features of the Late Bronze Age world, but the central reason its failure looks the way it does in the archaeological record. Sudden, near simultaneous and spread across an enormous geographic range rather than gradual and localized. A society specialized to the degree the Mycenaean palaces or the Hittite Empire were, dependent on imported tin for its weapons, dependent on imported grain in bad years, dependent on a narrow-trained class of scribes and administrators for its entire economic memory, gains tremendous efficiency and wealth from that specialization during good years, but loses the redundancy, the ability to simply do without a failed component that a more self-sufficient, less connected society would retain. When several of that system's load-bearing elements, a multi-generational drought, a cluster of major earthquakes, waves of displaced and opportunistic raiders, and chronic internal political strain arrived within the same 1 or 2 generations rather than spaced safely apart across centuries. The system did not have the redundancy left to absorb them one at a time. It had to absorb them together, or fail together. This is why Ugarit's own final letters name so many separate problems at once: an undefended coast, a fleet sent away to help an ally, enemy ships appearing offshore rather than a single named enemy, and why the collapse touched Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, Cyprus and the Levantine coast within roughly the same 40 to 50 years, rather than in a slow sequence spread across centuries. The Late Bronze Age did not fall to any one blow. It fell because it had built itself quite productively into a shape that could only really fail everywhere at once. Of all the collapses this story covers, the end of the Hittite Empire is in some ways the strangest, because the evidence at its own capital does not clearly show the kind of violent conquest a reader might expect from an empire that simply vanishes from the historical record within a generation. Excavations at Hattusa, the walled capital in central Anatolia with its monumental gates carved with lions and sphinxes, and its nearby rock sanctuary at Yazilikaya, where processions of Hittite gods are carved directly into living rock, found that by the time fire eventually swept through parts of the upper city, many of the buildings appear to have already been largely emptied of valuable goods, and the royal archive of clay tablets, while extensive, does not include documents from the empire's very last years, suggesting either that a final archive was kept elsewhere and lost, or that record-keeping itself had already begun breaking down before the end. Rather than a single dramatic siege, the pattern many archaeologists now read at Hattusa looks more like a gradual unravelling administrative functions ceasing, the population declining, the royal court possibly relocating elsewhere, perhaps toward a southern residence called Tarhuntassa that earlier Hittite kings had established as an alternate capital, before the final destruction, with squatters occupying parts of the abandoned city afterward and lighting the fires that left the visible burn layer excavators eventually found. Outside the capital, the picture across former Hittite territory is similarly one of dissolution rather than a single conquering blow. Local rulers in Anatolia and northern Syria, who had once answered to the Hittite king, simply stop appearing as Hittite vassals in the historical record and start appearing, in the following century, as independent or semi-independent successor states, a scattering of smaller kingdoms in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, at sites like Carchemish and Malatya, that modern historians group under the label Neo-Hittite, some of which continued using Hittite hieroglyphic writing, a distinct script from the cuneiform the imperial court had used for diplomacy, and honouring Hittite religious traditions for centuries afterward, evidence that Hittite culture did not vanish so much as the centralised empire holding it together did. A relief carved into a cliff face near modern Izmir, at a site called Karabel, showing a Hittite-style warrior figure, with an inscription once read by early travellers as evidence of an Egyptian conquest of Anatolia, later proved instead to be a boundary marker from this very borderland world, a small reminder of how much of this period's physical evidence has had to be carefully reread and redated as scholarship has advanced. What likely finished the empire, based on the threads already traced through this story, was less a single military disaster than the simultaneous failure of everything the empire's central authority depended on. A grain supply already strained by drought and now cut off as trade routes through Syria, and the Levant fell into disorder from raiders and displaced populations moving through exactly the territory. Hittite grain shipments needed to cross, a western frontier already restless from decades of trouble around Wilusa and Ahiawa, now further destabilized by the same wider unrest affecting the Aegean, a northern frontier still contested by the Casca after generations of inconclusive fighting, and a ruling dynasty whose legitimacy had already been repeatedly contested from within. An empire that depended this heavily on long supply lines running through other people's increasingly unstable territory did not need a single conquering army to fail. It needed only for enough of those supply lines to fail at once that the centre could no longer hold its vassals, feed its capital, or pay its own soldiers. The Hittite Empire's end reads, in the archaeological record, less like a building knocked down by a single blow and more like a structure whose foundations were quietly removed from underneath it until it had nothing left to stand on. In mainland Greece, the collapse arrived with unusual completeness. Within roughly 30 to 40 years around 1200 BC, every major Mycenaean palace centre, Pylos on the western coast, Mycenaean Tiryns in the northeastern Peloponnese, Thebes and the nearby fortress of Gla in the region of Boeotia, and the palace at Iolkos further north, was destroyed by fire, and none of them was ever rebuilt as a functioning palace afterward, even at sites where people continued to live among the ruins in reduced numbers. At Pylos, the destruction layer that accidentally baked and preserved the palaces, Linear B administrative tablets shows clear evidence of a sudden, catastrophic fire that swept through the entire central complex, consistent with the tablet's own last recorded concerns, watch posts on the coast, bronze allocations, rowers assigned to specific stations, a bureaucracy still trying to organise a defence in its final recorded season. At Mycenae, the citadel's massive fortification walls were expanded in this same general period, in what looks like a defensive response to a perceived threat, and a secret underground stairway was cut down to a hidden water source outside the original walls to guarantee access to water during a siege. Before the site was ultimately destroyed regardless, evidence that the palaces were not simply caught unaware, but were actively, and unsuccessfully, trying to prepare for whatever was coming. The most striking consequence of the palace destructions, and one of the clearest illustrations in the entire story of how thoroughly a specialized system can lose capability when its central institution disappears, is what happened to writing itself. Linear B had been used exclusively by palace scribes for palace administration. When the palaces burned, the institution that trained scribes needed written records and had any use for the script burned with them, and writing disappears entirely from the mainland Greek archaeological record for roughly 300 to 400 years, a period modern historians often call the Greek Dark Age, until a new script, the Greek alphabet, adapted from a Phoenician model, appears in the archaeological record centuries later. This did not mean Greek-speaking people ceased to exist, build things, or organize themselves in the intervening centuries. Archaeology shows continued settlement, some regional variation in prosperity, and cultural continuity in religious practice and language, and burial customs from this period, a shift away from the elaborate multi-generation chamber tombs of the palace era towards simpler individual cist graves, suggest a society reorganizing itself around smaller, less centralized communities rather than simply vanishing. But it does mean the specific administrative capacity to keep written records, and by extension much of the detailed historical memory of the preceding centuries, simply vanished along with the institution that alone had possessed it. Population also appears to have declined significantly across much of mainland Greece in the generations following the palace destructions. Based on the number of occupied sites, archaeologists can identify, with some regional surveys suggesting a drop of well over half the previously occupied settlements in parts of the Peloponnese, and long-distance trade goods that had been common in Mycenaean palace contexts, foreign pottery, imported metals, luxury items from Egypt and the Near East, become far rarer in the archaeological record of the following centuries. Consistent with the wider Eastern Mediterranean trade network, the palaces had depended on no longer functioning the way it once had. Greece did not disappear, but the particular, tightly centralized, literate, internationally connected version of Greek society that had built Mycenae's Lion Gate walls and Pylos' careful bronze inventories did, and what grew back in its place over the following centuries would eventually become something different again. A world of smaller, more scattered communities that had to rebuild much of their political and cultural life from a far more modest starting point. Egypt's survival through this period sometimes gets described, in simplified accounts, as though the kingdom emerged from the crisis largely unharmed, but the more detailed record tells a story of a state that endured while absorbing real and lasting losses. In the decades following Ramesses II's Year 8 victory over the Sea People's Coalition, Egyptian administrative and military presence across Canaan and the wider Levantine coast, territory Egypt had directly controlled or closely dominated for roughly 3 centuries since the early New Kingdom, contracted sharply and then largely disappeared, leaving the region's cities and small kingdoms to organize their own affairs, or fall to whichever new arrivals, including the settling Philistines, established themselves there instead. Within Egypt itself, later documents from Ramesses II's own reign describe not only the Deir el-Medina grain strike but also, near the very end of his life, a conspiracy within the royal household itself, a plot involving one of his own secondary wives, a woman named Ti, and a circle of palace officials apparently aiming to assassinate the king and place her son on the throne instead of the designated heir, a plot detailed in a set of surviving trial records known collectively as the Harem Conspiracy Papyri, which list the names and eventual punishments of dozens of conspirators, some forced to take their own lives, others mutilated, and at least one official apparently bribed into helping smuggle a wax figure of the king into the harem to be used in some form of magical attack against him. Ramesses III appears to have died around the time of, or shortly after, the plot was uncovered, and modern forensic examination of his mummy in recent years found a deep wound to the throat consistent with the assassination. The trial records describe settling a debate that had run for decades over whether the conspiracy had actually succeeded. The pharaohs who followed him, a long line of rulers who took the same throne name Ramesses in his honor, generally proved far less capable of holding Egypt's institutions together, and the wider period is marked by declining royal authority, including growing corruption and tomb-robbing scandals documented in surviving court records from Thebes, among them a text called the Papyrus Abbot, describing an official investigation into robberies at royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, rising power for the priesthood of the god Amun at the expense of the throne itself, and eventually, within roughly a century after Ramesses II's death, a political split in which Egypt effectively divided between a pharaoh ruling from the city of Tanis in the north and a high priest of Amun holding real power in Thebes to the south, figures like Smendes and Herihor governing what had once been a single unified kingdom, ending the unified new kingdom in all but name and opening what historians now call Egypt's third intermediate period. None of this looked, from the outside, like the sudden fiery destruction that ended Ugarit or the Mycenaean palaces. Egypt's decline was slower, its institutions bent rather than broken, and its heartland along the Nile remained continuously inhabited and administratively functioning, in a way Hattusa or Pylos simply did not. But the underlying pattern connects directly to the rest of the story. The same drought conditions the paleoclimate record shows across the Ouida region would have pressured Egyptian agriculture too, even along the comparatively reliable Nile. The same collapse of long-distance trade networks that starved bronze workshops elsewhere would have reduced Egypt's access to foreign metals, timber, and luxury goods as well, and the same loss of secure, garrisoned territory abroad that ended Hittite influence in Syria ended Egyptian influence in Canaan within roughly the same general period. Egypt did not fall. It survived by absorbing losses other kingdoms could not, but it emerged from the crisis a visibly smaller, weaker version of the empire that had once fought the Hittites to a standstill at Kadesh. The century and a half following the destructions this story has traced, roughly 1200 to 1000 BC, is often called, across several different regions, some version of a dark age, not because nothing happened, but because the written record that once let historians follow events year by year in Hittite, Mycenaean Greek, and Egyptian sources thins dramatically or disappears entirely across large parts of the affected world, leaving archaeology as the primary witness to what people were actually doing. What that archaeology shows is not universal devastation, but a genuine unevenness, some regions losing population and complexity for centuries, while a small number of others found real opportunity in exactly the vacuum the old great powers had left behind. Along the coast of what is now Lebanon, cities including Tyre, Sidon and Byblos, which had existed for centuries already as smaller partners within the old Bronze Age trade network dominated by Egypt and Hatti, emerged from the collapse as increasingly independent and increasingly dominant maritime traders in their own right, the beginning of what historians call the Phoenician world, sending ships the length of the Mediterranean, eventually founding colonies as far away as Carthage on the coast of North Africa. A later Egyptian document called the Report of Wenamun, describing a Theban official's difficult and humiliating journey to Byblos to buy cedar wood sometime around 1000 BC, gives a vivid, almost embarrassing glimpse of just how far Egyptian prestige had fallen by then, its once feared name no longer enough to guarantee an Egyptian envoy safe passage or fair treatment, forced instead to negotiate as one trader among many rather than as the representative of an empire. The Philistine cities along the southern Canaanite coast, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath and Gaza, likely populated at least partly by descendants of the Peleset named in Ramesses II's Sea People's inscriptions, developed into a distinct and, for a time, powerful cluster of city-states, appearing repeatedly in the following centuries' Israelite and Assyrian texts as significant regional rivals, while inland, in the highlands of Canaan, small hill country settlements that archaeology shows expanding rapidly in exactly this same post-collapse period, would, over the following centuries, develop into the early kingdoms later remembered as Israel and Judah, one more example of new political structures filling the space the old imperial framework had vacated. Perhaps the single most consequential development of this whole dark period was a change in writing itself. The Phoenician cities used, and helped spread, an alphabetic script of only around 22 consonant signs radically simpler to learn than the hundreds of complex signs required to master Linear B, Hittite hieroglyphs, or Egyptian hieroglyphic and cuneiform writing, all systems whose complexity had helped keep literacy locked inside a narrow palace-trained scribal class. An alphabet that a merchant, rather than only a career palace scribe, could plausibly learn to use spread along Phoenician trade routes across the Mediterranean over the following centuries, and when Greek-speaking communities adopted and adapted it, adding vowel signs for the first time in the script's history, sometime in the 8th century BC, the result was the direct ancestor of the alphabet this narration itself is, in its own way, still built from. The old Bronze Age system, in other words, did not simply vanish and leave emptiness behind. Its collapse cleared space for a genuinely different kind of world to grow in its place, more fragmented politically for a time, poorer in some visible respects, but eventually less dependent on the narrow, centralized, single point of failure institutions, the one palace, the one trained scribal class, the one fragile route for imported tin, that had made the late Bronze Age both so productive and so exposed. The great kings who once called each other brother across thousands of miles of sea and mountain road had built something remarkable, and something that, in the end, could only really fail the way it failed, not one kingdom at a time, but nearly everywhere, nearly at once, because everywhere had quietly made itself depend on everywhere else. Generations after the last Bronze Age palaces went dark, a trader from the Phoenician coast loaded his ship with cedar wood and jars of purple dye, and sailed toward a harbour that a Hittite governor or an Egyptian garrison commander would once have controlled, and found no garrison there at all, only a scatter of smaller towns making their own decisions, keeping their own accounts in an alphabet of barely 22 signs instead of the hundreds a palace scribe had once needed a lifetime to master. The great kings and their letters of brotherhood, their tin routes and their treaties were gone, and much of what grew in their place, for a while, was smaller, poorer, and far less able to write its own memory down. But the world that grew back was not simply the old world in ruins. It was, in places, freer for having fallen. A simpler alphabet spread along Phoenician sea lanes faster than cuneiform or hieroglyphic writing ever had, carried by merchants rather than palace-trained scribes. Small coastal kingdoms that had once been minor partners in someone else's empire built fleets and colonies of their own. A mainland Greece that had lost every one of its palaces would, centuries later, build something that owed nothing to Mycenaean's kings, and everything to what its people learned in the quiet after. The tin still had to travel. The clay, when writing returned, still carried messages between strangers who had never met. The lesson buried in the ash under a dozen burned halls is not that connection itself was the mistake. It is that a world built with no slack left in it has no room to fail slowly, and no way back once every support gives out together.